Former U.S. ambassador and author of a number of books, including The Universal Hunger for Liberty, which was published by Basic Books in 2004, and the best-selling The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. He has served on the faculties of Harvard University and Stanford University, among others, and currently holds the George Frederick Jewett Chair in Religion, Philosophy, and Public Policy at the American Enterprise Institute, and with his family lives in Washington, D.C. Jana Novak is also a published writer and a poet. She received a degree in political science from Duke University and has held editorial positions at a number of magazines, including The Washingtonian, Crisis, and Rising Tide. She spent a decade as a speechwriter, communications director, and advisor to several prominent national politicians, including members of the U.S. House and Senate, 3 speakers of the House of Representatives, and Senators Kay Bailey Hutchinson of Texas and Senator Brownback of Kansas. Both she and Mr. Novak come to us tonight to discuss their latest book, which they have co-authored, Washington's God, Religion, Liberty, and the Father of Our Country. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael and Jana Novak.
Thank you. Sorry, just getting my watch out. Washington's God, the beneficent author of all the good that was, that is, or that will be. The shot rang out suddenly, with no warning, whistling across the bright clearing. "Are you shot?" called out the young man, worried about his only companion. "No," came the answer. Within moments, the 2 men were upon the Indian, who, with gun dropped, could only struggle under their weight. Although breathing heavily, young George Washington was unscathed. How different our history would have been without this critical personality on our national stage. Indeed, Washington almost died 3 times during his trips to the Ohio Valley Wilderness when he was in his 20s. After the first such time, when all the other officers were shot and killed, yet he somehow survived, he wrote to his brother Jack, "I take this early opportunity of assuring you that I now exist and appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of Providence, that protected me beyond all human expectation. I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, and yet escaped unhurt." Through his experiences on the Monongahela, Washington learned invaluable lessons about the military, the Indians, the British, and about the character of men and the nature of God. These experiences proved to him that an intervening force was at work in American history and in his life, and that knowledge sustained him. Let me illustrate through another story. When Washington was unanimously elected Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in May 1775, the battle for Boston, right here, was the first major battle he was involved in and his first resounding success. Yet, were it not for the singular interposition of Providence hitherto, as Representative John Witherspoon of the Continental Congress tartly noted, it could have been a humiliating defeat. The first bit of providential news arrived when a privateer sent out by Washington captured a British supply ship weighted down with war material. Washington immediately wrote, "We must be thankful, as I truly am, for this instance of divine favor, for nothing surely ever came more apropos." Yet the American situation remained desperate. Enlistments for many soldiers had ended, and men were leaving in droves and taking with them their arms, which were desperately needed by the remaining army. Hundreds more were ill. Powder was in very short supply. Washington wrote to his secretary, Joseph Reed, "If I shall be able to rise superior to these and many other difficulties, I shall most religiously believe that the finger of Providence is in it, to blind the eyes of our enemies. For surely, if we get well through this month, it must be for want of their knowing the disadvantages we labor under." Dismal news, the American Army's attempt to take Quebec had been badly defeated, was lightened by good news. Colonel Henry Knox had retrieved the guns at Fort Ticonderoga and brought them, during an arduous month-long trek overland to just outside of Boston. This feat was quite Herculean, since the heavy guns, which were said to total more than 120,000 pounds, had to be pulled hundreds of miles in a nasty winter across lakes, mountains, and barely passable roads. Heartened, Washington developed a bold plan. The Americans would seize the hill of Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston Harbor, as you know, and lure the enemy into attacking them. Then, as the enemy attacked, the Americans would flank them and cross over into Boston, seizing the town. The key was that the Americans would take the Heights in a single night without alerting the British. With a frozen steep hilltop, as you know how tall that is, getting the guns on the Heights and building defensive fortifications seemed foolhardy and impossible. The date for the surprise maneuver was the night of March 4th, 1776. The next morning, March 5th, 220 years ago this week, the British were stunned to awaken to thousands of Americans and 20 guns staring down at them. Shock and awe indeed. British General William Howe had no choice but to attack. He spent the day readying his troops. At nightfall, a furious storm blew up, pounding the area through the next day. American Brigadier General William Heath concluded that kind heaven had stepped in to intervene. Meanwhile, General Howe, who took the providential opportunity to cancel his assault, retreated. And the Americans, after occupying the city and gazing out at its intricate inner defenses, recognized that their attack could not have succeeded without immense carnage. Truly a kind heaven. Unfortunately, the rest of the war did not prove to be so easy. It required immense patience and determination. This was a time of testing. It brought out the tough, inscrutable side of Providence. During this time, Washington offered much evidence about his beliefs. He never doubted that God favored the cause of liberty. This general order from him is one of many. The colonels or commanding officers of each regiment are directed to procure chaplains accordingly, to see that all inferior officers and soldiers pay them a suitable respect and attend carefully upon religious exercises. The blessing and protection of heaven are at all times necessary, but especially so in times of public distress and danger. The general hopes and trusts that every officer and man will endeavor so to live and act as becomes a Christian soldier defending the dearest rights and liberties of his country. Washington's life was filled with more events and decisions to be made than the average person's life. And while he was by no means a perfect man, certainly he was not above stark ambition, impatience, anger, and even arrogance. He, more often than not, made the right decision. The question is why? What led him on this path of doing the right thing? Not for himself necessarily, and not just for the good of the nation, though certainly it was, but in and of itself. For example, his decision to free his slaves after his death, the only founding father to do so. In fact, his heirs supported all the freedmen who needed help, not just the old and infirm, with their last payment recorded in 1833. In such matters, Washington always gave first credit to the almighty ruler of the universe, to divine providence. As he so succinctly stated in the midst of the war for independence, no man has a more perfect reliance on the all-wise and powerful dispensations of the Supreme Being than I have, nor thinks his aid more necessary. Clearly, Washington was not afraid to make plain his dependence upon God. In his private letters and in his public statements, and not merely public but official statements uttered in the role of commander-in-chief and later president, Washington seldom missed an opportunity to give praise to Providence and to beg God to continue favoring this nation. His behavior, especially as a public official, would certainly have sorely displeased today's ACLU. But the truth is that Washington and the other founders were simply far more religious than is deemed acceptable today. And it was those sentiments that allowed them to be the men that they were and to achieve what they did. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I can't tell you how happy I am to be back in Boston, where I first came as a very young man in 1951. Had never been this far east before, and where I then stayed for some 9 years in a row, living here at the hub of the universe, and thoroughly enjoying it. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for this institution, because I was able to come and do some research here that was just invaluable, though only for a couple of days, because of the Washington collection, which is just spectacular. As you know, the Athenaeum purchased the Washington Library when it was about to be sold, of all things, to the British. And such a humiliation they weren't willing to endure. And I have to tell you that they did it in the American way. They didn't turn to the government. They had a voluntary subscription among themselves and put this place up. That's what they meant by self-government. And it was quite an astonishing, it is a miraculous achievement, I think. So I commend all of you very, very dearly for this. It's so wonderful to open those books with the gloves that you're forced to wear, having removed from your mouth the chewing gum which you intended to carry over your thirst while you were working on it. The dear librarians were on my case on just about everything I did, I think, quite properly. And no pencils with erasers and things like that. But it was quite wonderful to be there with books that Washington had had in his hands, and that in fact sometimes he had made. That is, his favorite sermons he had collected in at least 2 volumes. And it was also really interesting to see little marks on the page. I can't prove they were his, but they seem to me, I'm no expert, they seem to me not different from the inscriptions of his name on the front, and seemed to me the same ink and so forth. But more than that, they sometimes marked, there was one sermon in particular, which he heard, he received 2 or 3 days after it was given from the preacher, and he then wrote a letter commending the argument on Providence that the preacher had made. And there are little marks in the printed version of the sermon, which he must have received later, near some of those passages. Again, I can't prove anything by it, but it was just stunning to me to see that. And there are all kinds of pamphlets that I didn't even imagine existed, including the pamphlet of the meeting of the Masons in New York City, 50 years after Washington had joined the Masons. And the most extraordinary thing is it began with a prayer which concluded in the name of Jesus Christ. The roster led full of names like Higgins and O'Hanlon, and the meeting was conducted rather like a meeting of the Knights of Columbus, it seemed to me, with 5,000 people there. The Masons in this country were certainly a bit different from the Masons in Europe. It was obvious. There was a sermon and a long lecture. Now, Yana is already getting nervous because one reason we wrote these out is she knows her father and knew the only way to keep me within confines was to have a script. So I will now try to be more obedient. The need for this book stems from the lack of interest in religion on the part of most biographers of Washington, especially since World War II. And indeed, as Gordon Wood agreed, with most historians, particularly of the last 50 years, much less interest in religion and religion of the founding than the historians of the preceding 150 years. The occasion for this book was a magnificent outdoor candlelight dinner on the veranda of Mount Vernon 3 years ago, at which the executive director, James Reese, asked me if I would write a book on Washington's religion. More than 1 million visitors come to Mount Vernon each year, he said. And at the bookstore, the book they most request is a book on Washington's religion, which they do not have. There's no book they want to hand out. And he wanted someone who he thought would be sympathetic both to reason and common sense and the Enlightenment and to religion. I'd done an earlier book, which he liked in that respect, called On Two Wings. I had a theory that Washington was more religious than most people thought, but I was basing this only on his public official statements as general and president. I would not have been surprised if more research showed that he was actually not much more than religious than Thomas Jefferson, probably the least religious of the founders, but by common consent. Jefferson, for instance, refused to be godfather to children who were, which he was invited to sponsor, on the ground that that would be hypocritical of him. He couldn't be in charge of their religious education if he didn't believe it. And Washington, by contrast, accepted 8 times and was quite serious in buying Bibles or prayer books for them, sending for them in London and embossed with their name, and following up with friendship for these youngsters. I would never have done the book at Mount Vernon if Jana hadn't decided to take a year off from politics, tired of the 7 o'clock in the morning meetings and the 10 o'clock in the evening meetings, and not even time to walk the dog, let alone to have a life. And our government chews up these young people for 10 years of their lives and sometimes more. But she was free, and she was willing to give a year to help me research. I could not possibly have done it. Now, since a large percentage of Washington's writings are now available online, research is infinitely easier than it used to be. Moreover, immense generosity was shown us by the Mount Vernon historical researcher Mary Thompson, who has been working on her own marvelous book on the religion of the Washington family over several generations, a book that I trust will be published very soon. Washington's personal library of some 900 plus volumes was also made available to us, both by the second copies collected at Mount Vernon and by the originals, owned and beautifully maintained by the Athenaeum, where we presently are gathered. And Washington's God, there's no doubt that Washington was a lifelong Anglican as his ancestors had been, and as his progeny, through Martha's children, were to be. Because of a clergy shortage, Washington's local parish church had services on average twice a month. He attended a little more than once a month, much more often in later years than in earlier. He was an active vestryman, that is, he attended the majority of the meetings, and during his service over 16 years, and church warden, giving the parish both his time and his financial help, and actually doing so for another parish in Alexandria simultaneously. His pastor cherished him as an unusually helpful parishioner. Jana and I, however, were able to find only a few clear confessional statements in which Washington openly declared his faith as a Christian. It's iffy from his written record to what an extent he was a Christian, that he was a religious man, no doubt. And then one needs to investigate what kind of religion, what kind of God. But he avoided confessional statements as much as possible. The example of his life is actually clearer than his words. From his 20s on, as a major in the Virginia militia, it's pretty amazing, but it's not so amazing. We have young men and women in Iraq who are about the same age. He's only 22, 23, 24, and he's a leader of 300 or 400 men in the field.